Leaders Like Us, Henry Louis Gates, Jr., written by J.P. Miller, illustrated by Markia Jenai. Tracing family roots. Who are you? Your history is more than your name. It is more than the names of your family members who are alive today. It goes further back in time. Who were your ancestors? Dr. Henry Louis Gates, Jr. wanted to help people learn about their ancestors. He wanted to help people understand their family history. In a television studio, Henry Jr. waited behind the scenes. He was about to begin filming his show, African American Lives. He was going to help his first guest discover who their ancestors were. He was a leader in genealogy. He had a lot of information to share. He was about to help many more people than just the ones on his show. A trip to the attic. The house was filled with family. Everyone was there after young Henry Jr.'s grandfather died. Henry Jr. followed his father up the stairs. It was his first time in his grandparents' attic. His father, Henry Sr., opened an old trunk. Inside were newspaper clippings and other Gates family treasures. He searched the stacks of papers until he found the obituary of his great-great-grandmother, Jane Gates. Henry Jr. read the article. It said that his great-great-grandmother was a good parent and that people liked her. It talked about how both black and white people respected her. It listed all of Jane Gates' children, but it did not say who the father of her children was. The trip to the attic changed Henry Jr. He became curious. He had questions about his paternal family. Henry Jr. set out to solve the mystery. Who was his great-great-grandfather? Henry Jr. made a special trip to the store to buy a spiral notebook. He was going to interview his family. He planned to write what they said in his notebook. His family was happy that he was interested in his family tree. They sat with him and shared funny stories, family celebrations, and pictures. Henry Jr. wrote it all down. He learned a lot about his family history. Still, there was something missing. Roots and trees. Family trees can be very important. They can help people understand their roots, how they are related to others. Some people even find out they are related to someone famous. Henry Jr. grew up. He left home for college. Researching family trees still excited him. He knew what he wanted to study, history. He did very well in college. He was asked to teach classes while he was still a student. He earned a doctorate in history. Soon, he was famous for his research. Henry Jr. watched a television show where a man traced his family tree all the way back to Africa. How did he do it? Henry wondered. He had tried, but he had no luck finding his great-great-grandfather. His family's history was missing information about when relatives were taken due to slavery. Other African American people wanted to discover their family trees too. He could become a leader and help people find their family history. Solving mysteries. Tracing family trees back to Africa was all Henry Jr. thought about. He spent day and night thinking of ways to do it. Suddenly, he had an idea. He could use DNA. It could be used to trace the family history of famous African American people all the way back to Africa. He spoke to people at PBS television about his idea for a show. He was already a leader in history. Now, he wanted to be a new kind of leader, too. PBS turned his idea into a television series called African American Lives. On each episode, Henry Jr. would get information from each family guest. He found out as much as he could about their family tree using official documents. He used information from the guest's DNA to learn more after that. He could finally tell people who their ancestors were. No other show was like this. He would lead the way once more. Henry Jr. had many famous people on his show. He had 8 guests the first time he made African American Lives. When he was done, he knew he could help many more people learn about their family history. Famous faces. One of the people that Henry Jr. interviewed was Oprah Winfrey, a famous talk show host. Other guests included comedians and scientists. Henry Jr. never found out who his great-great-grandfather was, but his search led him to change lives. He has won many awards for genealogy research. He has written books and articles. Many people started to research their family history because of him. Henry Jr. gave hope to Black people in Africa and America. He led them to learn their own family stories. We all have ancestors waiting to tell our family's story. It is my job to find those ancestors on your family tree. Open the door and let them talk. Henry Louis Gates, Jr.